Chapter 131, Requests, Hanyu's POV. Asau's laughter was harsh and ragged, reminding Hanyu of the screeching of some fierce desert bird. It filled the air, but he barely heard it. All he could hear were the echoes of that calm, despairing statement. "It would be better if I were dead." Gods! He was never going to forgive Hanyu. Hanyu was never going to forgive himself. Everything Asau was suffering was because of him, and there was nothing Hanyu could do to fix any of it. But why is he so upset? He gets to keep his place. Hanyu was still hunched at Antony's feet. He'd known deep down that his god would keep Asau no matter what, but he had to admit that his faith had been shaken when he heard that Asau could no longer serve as a food source. This wouldn't be like some kind-hearted human lord making space and finding tasks for an incapacitated slave. There simply wasn't enough space or work in the gods' rooms for such things. Antony would be ceding a large share of his limited space to somebody with no way to earn his keep. And he agreed to do it anyway. Hanyu loved him for that, loved him so fiercely that the emotion made his chest feel squeezed and crowded. He wished for a lot of things. An offering wasn't supposed to want, and now Hanyu understood why. It was just pointless and painful. Right now, though, what he wanted most was for Asau's horrible laughter to stop. Didn't the man understand that he would be all right? Antony was keeping him. There was no reason to be this upset. But Asau just kept laughing and laughing, his face a rictus of pain, no matter how gently and firmly Lord Julia spoke to him. Her transformation over the last few moments had been dizzying. When Asau was calm, she had seemed like a punished child, cringing and apologizing. As soon as he began to cackle, however, she had pulled herself together and seemed more like her usual controlled self. "We're going to do some counting now," she told Asau calmly. "We're going to count down from 100, and we're going to breathe after every other number. Ready?" Asau didn't show any sign that he'd heard her. His laughter continued unabated. 100, 99. Breathe in. 98, 97. Breathe out. Antony stirred above him, and Hanyu brought his attention back to his master. The god looked pained and miserable, but that was hardly a change from the way he'd looked at any other time in the last few days. The only real exception had been when he'd leaned in to kiss Hanyu, his face so soft and open that Hanyu would never have been able to believe that it wasn't genuine if he hadn't seen with his own eyes how much control his master had over his facial expressions. If Antony wanted to look love-struck as part of a punishment, Hanyu had no doubt that he could manage to do it. "I deserved it," he reminded himself ferociously. "It hurt worse than anything else could have done, but I deserved all of that and more for what I did." "I think I should go," the god said softly, the lack of his tongue tip painfully obvious in his inability to form a th or a d sound. Hanyu's guilty conscience pricked him anew at the absence. "He didn't like it when I saw him upset before." Thad got to his feet, looking desperately unhappy. "Let me help you." He hoisted Antony to his feet and helped him to the door. Hanyu trailed after them, hating to go, but determined to do his duty and stay with his master. He looked back over his shoulder before Thad closed it after them. Lord Julia was still crouched in front of Asau, not touching him, but counting calmly. And though he showed no sign of joining her counting, his laughter was tapering off, and his breath seemed to be beginning to match with hers. 72. Breathe out. 71, 70. Breathe in. The door closed, and they were in the corridor. "I'll be fine if you want to go back," Antony offered as Thad towed him down the hall. "That is, if you don't mind helping me, Hanyu. You don't have to." Why would his god ask that in such a hesitant tone of voice? Why was he even asking? He could just command Hanyu to help him. Surely he didn't think Hanyu was so disobedient that he would refuse any and all orders his master gave him, did he? It proved not to be an issue, because Thad just shook his head and kept going. It's better to leave them alone. I'm sure you're right, and Asao would rather not have an audience. Anyhow, once he's calmed down, he and Julia are sure to have a great deal to say to one another. No doubt, Antony growled, and the anger in his voice frightened Hanyu into speaking out of turn. Please don't be angry with Lord Julia, he squeaked, already cursing himself for opening his fool mouth. I'm sure she didn't mean to tamper with your things without your permission, my lord. Thad nearly tripped. Oh dear. My things? Antony sounded bewildered, but then his face and tone darkened. Do you mean Asao? Well, yes. Hanyu winced in sympathy as his master stumbled and let out a sharp hiss of pain. And his blood. It's yours, and I'm sure she didn't mean... She meant to keep him alive, Antony snapped, and Hanyu fell silent. That's what one generally expects a healer to do. I don't give a fuck about his blood. I'm just glad he's... Hanyu, surely you don't think I'd be angry that he saved his life just because it might inconvenience me a little? The last question came out a little sharper, a little more wounded, and Hanyu flinched again. When Antony put it that way, it did sound a little callous. How could I say that? Antony had never been anything but kind and merciful to him and Asao both. How could Hanyu have been so unfair as to say anything that indicated that he saw his master as some kind of brute? But that didn't make sense either. He'd only been asking whether Antony was angry about having his property rendered unusable. Asao was his property, as was Hanyu, and there was nothing wrong with acknowledging that fact. Why should anyone take it as an accusation of heartlessness? It wasn't wrong for Antony to treat them as the slaves they were. It just sounded wrong when the god said it that way. Everyone's just glad that you're all safe, Thad put in, sounding a little panicked by all the tension. No one's worried about inconveniences or anything like that, and no one thinks you would be either, Antony. You two just need a rest. So does Jules, though she hates to admit it. I've been resting, Antony growled, putting all the burden on Julia and Theo and all of you. You're not a burden, Thad insisted. Antony snorted. You're holding me up, practically carrying me. That's the definition of a burden. Is that why you asked if I would help you? Hanyu burst out, horrified. You're worried about burdening me, my lord? It sounded absurd as soon as it was out of his mouth. However, Antony's quickly averted eyes and grouchy, indistinct muttering told him that his guess had been right. It was completely bizarre. Hanyu was his slave. It was impossible for his god to burden him because all his time and all his efforts belonged to his master anyway. Why on earth would Antony worry about something like this? He worried that he'd made me angry. He worried every time he scared me. He's always treated me better than any god in any story back at the temple. And how did I repay that kindness? My lord, you saved my life, he cried, grateful that no one else was in the hallway at the moment to hear the way he kept speaking out of turn. After everything you've done for me, nothing you could command of me would feel like a burden. Of course you know I'll obey. Please, please believe I'll obey. But I hope you also know that I'm willing to obey and grateful. I'd be so, so grateful for any way I could serve you, my lord. He'd hoped that this would clear up any misunderstanding. Instead, Antony's face took on that slapped expression it wore sometimes, and he turned to glare at the hallway in front of him, not deigning to respond to Hanyu's expressions of devotion. See? No one minds, Thad said gently. You've been through so much, all three of you. We're your friends, Antony, and we just want to help. I can hardly complain, Antony snapped. I'm the one who let... who let him get away with everything and made him my second." "What in the world?" Hanyu opened his mouth to demand what exactly his god meant by that, but then Thad and Antony stopped and he realized that they'd arrived at their door. "That reminds me," Thaddeus fumbled with the handle, his attention clearly distracted. "Is Marcus going to be officially removed from his post?" Antony winced, and Hanyu wasn't sure whether it was from the movement against his sore shoulder or the question. "Yes." "Then who will be taking his place?" "I hadn't really thought about it." Antony closed his eyes, as though he wished to go on not thinking about it. "But it would make sense to name Theo as my second in command. I should have done it ages ago." Thad had finally wrestled the handle open, but at this he whipped his head around, eyes wide. "You're going to make Theo the war chief?" "Fuck no." Antony huffed a laugh at the idea. "But we live on a boat. I think it makes more sense to have the navigator as second than the war chief anyway." No one spoke for a few moments after that. Antony had clearly worn himself out with his journey to the infirmary, and his face was drawn with pain as Thad walked him through the door. Hanyu scurried ahead, desperate for something, anything helpful to do. The best he managed was to pull a pillow out of the way as Thaddeus lowered Antony onto the sofa. Antony's breath hissed out, his face twisting with pain as he settled onto the cushions. Hanyu could only stare, hating his helplessness as much as he had in the infirmary with Asao. "I'm no use to either of them." "Who will you appoint as your new war chief?" Thad asked once Antony's eyes were open and his face was less dazed with pain. "Felix?" Antony nodded. "Yes, I think so. I had been planning to create a new position for him, but I suppose it can't be helped. Maybe I can ask Iorita about the new job instead." Hanyu was about to ask what the new position would be, but Thaddeus was pacing in front of the sofa, his hands beginning to flap, and clearly only half listening to anything Antony was saying. "Good! Lovely!" Thad cleared his throat. "Antony, you really don't mind about Asao?" Antony scowled ferociously. "What does everybody around here take me for? Of course I don't mind. After all he's been through, I don't care if that man does another chore or fulfills another duty for the rest of his life. I'm not going to get pissy that I can't drink from him." "Right, of course." Thaddeus nodded, his hands flapping faster. "I didn't mean to imply, you still want him here with you?" "I'm not going to throw him out," Antony snapped. "My home is his. Anything I can do for him, ever, it's his." Hanyu was dumbstruck. Since when did Antony feel so vehemently about Asao? He'd always seemed wary of the man, circling him as though he were afraid to speak or get too close or even look at him sometimes. Hanyu remembered the way he used to sneak through his own bedroom when he wanted to get dressed before they were awake, jumping guiltily and behaving like he'd been caught breaking into the place every time they opened their eyes. Such caution hardly seemed likely to inspire declarations like these. Still, there was no doubting the intensity under Antony's cankerous tones. Maybe Hanyu had misunderstood Antony's awkwardness? Perhaps he had been interested in using Asao the whole time and still felt a certain sentimental attachment to the former object of his desire. Or perhaps he felt kinship with Asao because of the way they had both suffered at Marcus's hands. Maybe it was none of those things. Maybe it was just Antony's own goodness, his instinct to shelter and care for a human in dire straits. Thaddeus apparently sensed Antony's sincerity as well. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "Yes," he said. "Yes, that's lovely. If you ever felt otherwise, well, I'd be delighted to have him come live with me." Hanyu was momentarily startled by the offer. He thought that this new development would put an end to that idea. Thad didn't have a second attendant who could feed him after all. If he gave Asao his spare room, it would mean that he was precluding the possibility of acquiring an attendant who could keep him fed without the trouble of going to the barracks. No matter how much he liked Asao, surely that was too big of a loss. But then Hanyu remembered the way Thaddeus had stared at Esau, reverent and admiring despite all his new scars, and his surprise dwindled. Of course Thad still wanted him. Hanyu should have been happy for his friend. Instead, the thought gutted him. It was like one of the stories back at the temple. How would this new story be told? Once upon a time, there were 2 offerings. One offering was good and loyal, thinking only of how to serve the gods and obeying every order with his whole heart. The other was clumsy and loud and stupid and selfish and demanded too much from his master without ever giving anything worthwhile in return. The good offering was cared for and treasured unconditionally, even when his beauty and utility were gone, because the perfect submission of his soul was worth more than a sea of blood. The bad offering was punished by being taunted with a parody of that kind of affection, because it was the only way his poor master could teach such a disobedient wretch his place. Which offering would you rather be, boys? Antony seemed just as startled as Hanyu had initially been. Are you asking me to give you a thou? Oh dear. Thaddeus's hands were a blur. Not if he doesn't want it, of course. I know it's quite an honor for him to belong to you, and of course here he gets to live with Hanyu, and you did save his life and all, so I would understand completely if he didn't, but if he did want it, well... Thad hesitated, then stopped pacing and turned to look Antony full in the face. Well, yes, I suppose I am.